The cock crowed before the first faint streaks of dawn touched the low sky over the Virginia tidewater. Inside a one-room wooden cabin, the Hardy family stirred awake. The night had been bitter, the air seeping through the cracks between the rough-hewn boards. Frost had crusted on the inside of the shutters. There was no glass window, only oiled paper stretched across a wooden frame, letting in a faint gray glow. 9-year-old Thomas was the first to wake. He shivered under the thin wool blanket and glanced at the hearth. The fire had died down to nothing more than a few faintly glowing embers. Panic pricked him. If the fire went out entirely, they would have no warmth, no way to cook, no safety from the cold until his father could strike flint and steel again. Carefully, with the solemn responsibility of a boy who already understood survival, Thomas took a splinter of pine, coaxed the embers, and blew gently. A thread of smoke rose, then a flicker of flame caught. Relief loosened his shoulders. By then, his mother Martha was up, tying a kerchief over her hair. She praised Thomas with a weary smile, though her hands already busied themselves with setting the iron pot over the rekindled fire. Cornmeal mush would be breakfast, with perhaps a bit of milk if the cow had yielded enough yesterday. She glanced at her youngest, a toddler still wrapped in blankets, and muttered a short prayer under her breath, "Thanks for another morning of life." In these colonies, one never took life for granted. John Hardy, the father, rose last. He pulled on his coarse homespun breeches and heavy boots, his face already grim with the weight of the day ahead. Outside, the fields waited, fields that never yielded enough to ease the family's burdens, fields that demanded endless sweat from sunup to sundown. Across the river, however, life began differently. At Fairmount Hall, the plantation house of Colonel James Ashby, sunlight filtered through proper glass windows imported from London. The rooms were large, with separate chambers for sleeping and dining, and servants bustled about even before the family stirred. Lady Ashby had awoken to tea, real tea, though taxed heavily by the crown, and sweet biscuits prepared in a proper brick hearth. Yet even here, wealth could not banish hardship entirely. One of the house servants coughed badly as she carried in wood. Disease spared no one, rich or poor. All feared the fevers and fluxes that swept through the colony with little warning. Colonel Ashby himself, though proud in wig and fine coat, had buried 2 children before their first birthdays. Even amid luxury, the fragility of life was never forgotten. Back in the Hardy cabin, Martha sent her eldest daughter, Anne, to fetch water from the well. The girl trudged barefoot, balancing a wooden bucket against her hip. Water was heavy, and it would be used sparingly, first for cooking, then perhaps for rinsing hands. Baths were rare, and nobody thought much of it. Cleanliness, they believed, came more from moral purity than from soap and water. Inside, Martha spun flax into thread while keeping an eye on the pot. Thomas, now dressed in patched breeches, helped his father with the animals, chickens to feed, a cow to milk. Every task mattered, for a single slip could mean hunger. By mid-morning, John Hardy led Thomas to the field. They set to plowing, their hands stiff in the cold air. "Remember this, boy," John muttered, guiding the worn plowshare through stubborn soil. "The land feeds us if we wrestle it hard enough. No one else will." Thomas nodded, though his eyes wandered toward the river where he could just glimpse the distant white walls of Fairmount Hall. He had heard tales of the Ashby children, who had tutors to teach them Latin and mathematics, who owned fine books with gilt edges. He wondered what it was like to live without hunger gnawing at your belly, to hold a quill instead of a hoe. But envy had no place in a poor farmer's day. The plow pulled on, and Thomas bent his shoulders to the work. Meanwhile, at Fairmount Hall, young Edward Ashby sat at a polished desk as his tutor drilled him in arithmetic. His sister Charlotte practiced her stitching under the sharp eye of Lady Ashby. Their lessons were strict, their manners carefully molded for the society of the gentry. Yet Edward sometimes gazed out the tall window toward the fields, where he saw boys not much older than himself laboring in the furrows. He envied them their freedom, not realizing that what he saw as freedom was toil from which there was no escape. As noon approached, both rich and poor prepared their meals. At the Hardy cabin, it was cornbread baked in the ashes, a bit of salted pork, precious and rationed, and ale brewed from corn. At Fairmount Hall, it was roast fowl, vegetables from the plantation garden, and fine wine imported from Madeira. Yet both meals were eaten with gratitude, for food was never to be wasted. Behind every bite was the knowledge of how precarious survival could be. The midday sun rode high, though its warmth was faint in the crisp Virginia air. Work never ceased. For the Hardy family, John and Thomas returned from the fields with aching backs and dirt under their nails. Martha and Anne had finished churning butter, their arms sore from the steady rhythm. Even the toddler had his part, keeping quiet, staying out of the fire's way, clapping at the sight of chickens scratching in the yard. But on this day, there was a greater task to share. Their neighbors were raising a barn, and that meant the Hardys, like every family in the settlement, would join. By afternoon, the clearing rang with voices and the thud of timber. Men hauled heavy beams, sweat darkening their shirts despite the cool air. Axes bit into wood, hammers clattered, ropes strained. John Hardy worked alongside his neighbors, men he had quarreled with over boundaries, traded with for seed, prayed beside on Sundays. Here, those differences fell away. One family's barn was everyone's barn, for disaster spared no one. Nearby, women gathered in a circle beneath a tree. Quilts stretched over wooden frames, bright scraps of cloth pieced into patterns. They chatted as nimble fingers stitched, news of births and deaths, whispers of fever in a neighboring settlement, speculation about the price of tobacco at the market in Williamsburg. Martha Hardy listened, speaking little, but each stitch she placed was a link in the chain that bound her to her community. Children darted about, chasing one another between piles of wood, though always under watchful eyes. Accidents could happen easily. An errant kick from a horse, a slip from a timber. Life here allowed no margin for carelessness. As dusk fell, the barn's skeleton stood tall against the reddening sky. The men cheered, wiping sweat from their brows. Food appeared, simple, hearty fare shared by all. Cornbread, stewed beans, cider passed from hand to hand. The meal was rough but joyous, flavored with the knowledge that survival came easier together than alone. Thomas sat with other boys, gnawing at a piece of bread, and listened as the men talked. Some complained of the king's taxes, of the endless demands from across the ocean. "Why must London's hand be in every pocket?" one muttered. Another spat into the dirt and growled, "We do the work here. We bleed here. Let them try and live as we do, then speak of their rights over us." Thomas didn't understand all of it, but he remembered the anger in their voices. Seeds were being planted, seeds that would, in time, grow into something far greater than any of them could imagine. Night came quickly. The Hardys returned to their cabin, weary but content. Inside, the hearth glowed again, its light flickering against the rough walls. Martha set out bowls of broth, ladled carefully to make it stretch. They ate in silence, broken only by the crackle of fire and the occasional cough. Afterward, John read a passage from the family Bible by candlelight. His voice was rough but steady, the words of Scripture weaving faith into the fabric of their weary lives. To them, God's providence explained much: why children sickened, why crops failed, why some prospered and others did not. Yet alongside faith lived a fierce pride in endurance, in the strength to survive another day. In Fairmont Hall, the Ashbys also closed their day with prayer, though theirs was offered in a grand parlor, beneath the soft glow of imported candles. Yet despite the polish of silver goblets and velvet chairs, Lady Ashby's eyes lingered on her youngest child, asleep in a cradle. She thought of the fever that had swept away her sister's family last winter. Wealth might build walls, but it could not hold back death. When the candles were snuffed and the fire banked low, the colony lay in darkness. Crickets sang in the fields, wolves howled far off in the woods. Within the Hardy cabin, Thomas curled close to the fire, his belly only half full but his spirit steady. He thought of the barn rising against the sky, of the men's angry words about the distant king, of the pride in his father's voice when he said, "The land feeds us if we wrestle it hard enough." Tomorrow would be the same, hard, cold, and unrelenting. Yet tomorrow, too, they would endure. And though none could yet see it clearly, in their endurance lay the makings of a people who, one day, would no longer bow to distant masters.